Hello, my dear friends. Shavua Tov. I hope you're all doing very well. Today we're going to be learning the 9th chapter in the laws of the Tefillin, Mezuzah, and Sefer Torah, the Torah Scroll. We're going to be learning a very interesting law today, all about the way a Torah is supposed to be written. And it's actually quite fascinating. It took me some time to get this all straight. Very interesting law. The idea is as follows. When a Torah is written, it has to be written in a way that its length, the length of the Torah, so in other words, if we have the length of the Torah like this, the length should not be more than its circumference. Okay? The circumference of a Torah is the entire Torah when it is rolled up. So, the way it works is like this. I'm going to give this over I'm going to try to do it as clear as possible. It's a little bit complicated, a little bit mathematical, but we'll try to get to the bottom as easily as we can. So, if we have the length of a Torah, which is all the way from the top to the bottom, we want it to be the same length as if you take all the pages of the Torah that you're going to write on. So you have many, many pieces of parchment, and you're going to roll them all up, all into one roll, just like that. You want it to be the same circumference as its length. So the length is this long, but you have so many papers, so many pieces of parchment, that the circumference is going to be the same as the length. So if your Torah is 6 handbreadths long, so you want it also to be 6 handbreadths when it is all rolled up together. What happens then? So then, when you write the Torah and you take all these pages and you're going to sew them together and create your entire full width of this Torah, it's actually essentially it's the same circumference in its height, in its length, and it's all the pages together. And this is an interesting thing. It was passed down from Moses, from Mount Sinai, that this is the way a Torah is supposed to be. Now, what's the problem? If you have all these pages, you have to know what font size is going to fit in exactly this amount of pages. So in other words, you're adding more and more pages until it gets to the exact size of the size that it needs to be of the circumference, that it should be the same as the length of the Torah. And now, you have to know what size it's going to be. So you have to test out the text of what you're writing to see exactly how many words you're going to be able to fit onto one column. You have many, many columns in the Torah across all the pages of the Torah, and you have to see if the size that you've written, you're going to do a test writing of one or a few columns to see how large you're writing the letters, and then ultimately, based on that, you'll know if all of this will fit into this amount of space, or is it too large or too small. So based off that, that's how the scribe is going to write Torah. So it's very interesting. It comes out that the text has to be extremely exact in its size, and ultimately dependent on the size that it's going to fit into the scroll. And so that's pretty much the base of it. And there are a few details that go along with it. So the Rambam says that there has to be certain spaces on this piece of parchment. Every piece of parchment needs to have the text. So you're going to have a few columns going down the page. But you need to have 4 finger breadths on the top. So just like that. And then you need to have 3 on the bottom space, and in the middle you have the column. Between every column you want to have 2 finger breadths, between every column. So, and the text goes in the center of that. And because of all of this, the Rambam says, and he actually gives his directions of the Torah that he himself wrote. He wrote a Torah, and he gives the directions of exactly the Torah that he built And ultimately, according to that, you can know how to write it. So it's interesting because at the end of the day, if you look at a Torah, very often you'll find that there are Torahs that, if you look in the two Torahs, they're actually going to look identical in the words on the columns of how it's set up exactly, because it has to be in this exact size. So depending on the height of the Torah, how many lines there are in a column, how wide every column is, etc. So then you're going to know exactly which word should be where. And you can have Torahs that look identical, although it's written by a person. The Torah is not printed; it's all handwritten by a human being, by a scribe. But they are so exact; it's amazing when you see it. And the Rambam says that his Torah that he wrote was like this. He had every column was 4 finger breadths wide. That's the width of every column. And the song of Az Yashir, when the Jewish people crossed the Red Sea, as well as the song of Ha'azin, which is a second song that is in the Torah. There are 2 songs. Over there, the columns are a little bit wider. Those were 6 finger breadths wide. Now, every column had 51 lines. The amount of columns in the entire Torah was 226. 226 columns across the Torah. And the entire Torah was 1,366 finger breadths wide. That's the entire Torah. Obviously the Torah is very long. But according to these measurements, that's how you can write the Torah. So that's the Rambam's Torah was in such a way, and he gives us directions. And if you want to write a Torah according to these measurements, you can just copy these calculations that he did. Now there's another couple details that we have to mention, which is that at the beginning and the end of the Torah, we have the poles of the Torah. They're wooden poles, which we hold the Torah by these poles. So we need to leave a little bit extra space in the beginning and the end. We don't just start writing the text right at the beginning of the parchment. We actually have to leave some blank space so that we can wrap the parchment around the pole and sew it on so that it can be tightly connected to the poles. And the way we sew the parchment in general, also onto the poles, but also every page to itself, is done with the sinus of a kosher animal. Whether it was slaughtered or just passed away on its own, it doesn't matter. As long as it comes from a kosher animal, it is good. And this is also passed down from Moses all the way from Mount Sinai, that this is the way it's supposed to be done. And if it was sewn with the sinus of a non-kosher animal, so then we have to undo it and re-sew it with sinus from a kosher animal. And an interesting thing is that when you sew 2 pages together, so he says that you should leave a little bit on the top and the bottom that is not sewn together. Rather, you should leave it unsewn, so that if the Torah rips, it's going to rip from the top or from the bottom and not from the center, so that it doesn't ruin the Torah. And so you leave the top and the bottom unsewn. They put like a little, almost like a band-aid it looks, but it's a piece of parchment which is stuck on that keeps it together so that it shouldn't open up. But it's not sewn, so that if God forbid a Torah starts ripping, it's going to rip from the top or from the bottom, and it's going to be easier to fix it. Now, if a Torah does get ripped, what happens? So if it's an older Torah, so then if it's contained within 2 lines, so then you're able to sew it up again, and it's going to be fine. But if it's already more than 3 lines of a tear, it's a long tear in the middle of the parchment. Not if it tears on the seams, then you just re-sew the seam. But if it tears the actual parchment tore, so then if it's more than 2 lines, so then it's no good. But if it's a newer Torah, so then it's okay. You can sew it back up because it's still a quality Torah. and as long that it doesn't ruin any of the letters, and it doesn't deform any letters, so then the Torah will be fit for use, and you can use it again. So that is the chapter of Rambam for today. Very interesting in the details of how the Torah is supposed to be an exact size. So it's not just that it, take any page, start writing. It doesn't work like that. It's very specific in the size of how, as we've been learning, the paragraphs of the Torah, the size of the letters, the length and the width of the Torah. All of this is extremely specific, and it has to be done in a proper way. So next time you see a Torah, you'll recognize the specialty of how much work has gone into this. It actually takes a year for a scribe who is working full-time to write a Torah. So you can imagine how much a Torah costs. It's at least 40, 50 grand. But that's our chapter for today, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a very good one in the meantime.